And to be honest, if I were the Taliban, I would have done exactly what the Taliban did, which is go through the motions, not get anywhere, deliberately not get anywhere in the talks, double down on their own military action because they understood, I think, what the Trump administration was trying to achieve, which was to disentangle itself from Afghanistan and wait us all out. That's exactly what I'd have done.
SAS men jumped back onto the balcony and stormed. After 6 days and almost 11 hours exactly, the siege is over.
Hello, so I'm here with Sir Laurie Bristow. Laurie, welcome to the podcast.
Hello, it's good to be here.
I've been talking to a few people. I think it's quite opportune having you on, actually, because we just did an interview with Colonel Stuart Tootle, who took the British paratroopers into Helmand province in 2006. And now we're talking to you as the last ambassador during the most recent sort of time of British intervention into Afghanistan. And you wrote this excellent book, which I've read, Kabul, The Final Call. We'll hold that up, which is, I'd highly recommend anyone with an interest in the subject, or diplomacy, or war fighting, or Kabul, or any of the above, should definitely get a copy of. I suppose in many ways, Final Call is both it's a diary and possibly a critique. Is that fair to say, Laurie, of policy out there, maybe?
Yeah, well, it might be just worth if I start with saying a few words about why I wrote the book and what it seeks to achieve. So I think, as you say, I was the last UK ambassador in Afghanistan at the time of the fall in 2021. It was the end of a 20-year campaign. A lot of British people served there. It was a major, at one stage, actually identified by David Cameron as the UK's top foreign policy priority. And it all came to an awful end in a very short period of time. And of course on my watch. So part of what I was trying to do there is actually make sense for myself as much as anyone else as to what happened and why it happened, what I thought of it, and a bit of what did it feel like at the time. So I mean, the background to the thing is that when I got back, August 2021, an old friend called Iraj Bagazadi, he's unfortunately died since, sat me down and said, "Can I have first refusal on the book?" And I said, "Well, you can, but I'm not going to write it. And here are the reasons why." And he basically just worked at me saying, "Here are the reasons why you must write it." And basically it was that there is literally no one else who can give a perspective on this from the intersection of the politics, what it was like on the ground, the military dimension, the reasons for the collapse, but also, those sort of hideous days of the evacuation. I don't pretend that it's in any way a work of scholarship or an official history. It's to be understood as really what it looked like, what it felt like on the ground in the moment.
I've got to say, it's eminently readable. I mean, it's a great read. If we step back, because people probably don't know your work, being in the Foreign Office, Foreign Commonwealth Office. But if we just step back a bit, if I give it, I'm going to give a very quick bio for you, which feel free to correct. But basically, Trinity College, Cambridge, and then you joined what was then the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. You did NATO Defence College in Rome in 2002. You were then in the Iraq Policy Unit in 2003. Ambassador to Azerbaijan 2004, deputy head of the mission to Moscow 2007. 2010, you were then London Director, Eastern Europe, Central Asia, correct? And then 2012, Director, Intelligence, National Security, and then 2015, Ambassador to Russia. So, I mean, that's just a snapshot of a very varied diplomatic career. And I suppose to people like me, and I was in the military, diplomacy is a black box. We don't know what happens. We occasionally come across you guys in embassies and stuff. We don't really know what you do. So maybe we start right back at the beginning. You finish your degree at university and you're going to join the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. I mean, what was interesting about diplomacy to you? What would attract you to this career?
Well, I mean, if you think of the time scale, so it was 1989 that I was finishing up at university trying to decide what to do next. And two things were happening. One, of course, was this huge wave of change sweeping across Eastern Europe. So, for those of us old enough to remember the fall of the Berlin Wall, I mean, name me a bigger thing that happened in our lifetimes. And we're dealing with the consequences of that one way or the other, good and bad. The other thing that happened, rather more personal, my by then wife was working for an aid and development charity. And she was traveling all over the world in some fairly edgy places. I was looking at that thinking that looks rather more interesting than most of the available alternatives. Let's give it a go. And so I applied to the Foreign Office in that period of 1989 into 1990. To my amazement, they offered me a job, and they kept offering me interesting jobs. And I think, if there's any continuity across those years, I mean, it's really two things. One is Russia. I'm a Russia specialist. It's the subject I work most on. It really matters. I mean, certainly now it matters more almost than ever in some ways that we'll discuss a bit later. The other, though, it's that period from the optimism of the end of the Cold War, the fall of the Berlin Wall, through to the world we're living in now. So we went through this very broad arc where almost anything felt possible. And now we're back in a world of extreme turbulence, very, very high risk. It's really hard to make sense of it. And just one word or one sentence answer your question, what do diplomats do? You try and make sense of all of that. You try and work out what the national interest is in that, and then you do it.
And so you obviously then become an ambassador. I imagine that is the role to which everyone aspires. It's sort of the generalship role within the service, if it's called a service. And so you start doing that. And then how does that work? Just generalist ambassador. What is the job of an ambassador for the British government?
Yeah. Well, of course, it depends the kind of the country you're in, or of course, some ambassadors are accredited to international organizations like the United Nations or the European Union or NATO or whatever. But for me, over the years, I've crystallized this down to a very small number of top-level things. One is understand the country or the organization you are sent to. That's why you need things like language skills. You need to know the country, you need to know its history, you need to travel in it, because of course, as we all know, if you take, for example, the United States, if you spend all your time inside the Beltway in Washington, you've got a very strange idea of what kind of country the US is. Second, no less important, is understand your own country, what its view of itself is in the world, what it's trying to achieve, whether you're in cooperation or competition or conflict with the country that you're accredited to, or some combination of those. And giving the government in London your best advice about what the national interest is and how to achieve it. And the third, of course, is its leadership. So you'll be very familiar with this from the military context. You've got, in my case, anything from 30 people in Azerbaijan through to however many hundred it was in Afghanistan. And you've got to set the direction. You've got to set the direction and the tone. What are we trying to do and how are we going to do it? And, that's a sort of day in, day out part of the job.
I mean, it is fascinating. But obviously Russia and the Moscow Post is big, so we might circle back to that. But if we just run into like Afghanistan, so there's a question in my head, which is, given British involvement in Afghanistan, being offered the job to Ambassador Kabul in the circumstances in which you were offered it, and for the audience, if you know a bit about history, the first Afghan war ended with one survivor, I think it was, when the retreat from down the Khyber Pass went wrong and 16,000 people were massacred. So you're offered this in the full knowledge of what's going on. There's going to be an exit that's well underway, and they come to you. I mean, what is there a reason why they specifically come to you? Is it the rush wrangle experience? And then what were your thoughts on receiving the job offer?
That's a very good question. And a lot of people have asked me that question, actually rather unhelpfully. At the height of the evacuation, one of my many social media trolls pointed out exactly that point about, just remember how this ended before. I really didn't need to be reminded of that information at the time. But no, seriously, why that job? Why me? I'm not an Afghan specialist in the sense that I've not spent huge amounts of time working in that country. As I said, I'm a Russia specialist. The things, though, in my background that I think really were a reason why I was offered the job were, first of all, that I've done a lot of work over the years, particularly in the national security space, and within that specifically on Afghanistan and the other big counterterrorism theatres. I knew my way around both the operational imperatives in Afghanistan, essentially what we were trying to do and what were the capabilities we needed to do that. Also, the political compliance, legal risks around that. So the sort of flip side of that job, how do you balance off what you're trying to achieve against the possible costs and risks in that. And the other thing, more general than that, because of the number of roles I'd done in the past, I'd done a lot of crisis management and crisis leadership, whether in the UK or abroad. And it kind of comes with the territory with both Russia and counterterrorism. Because of those two things, I knew my way around the institutions of particularly the national security agencies, but also the military. As to why I took it, well, I have been asked that question, including by some close relatives. I ask it a lot myself, and somebody had to do it. And when I was offered the job towards the end of 2020, it was pretty obvious that there was a very, very big turning point coming up. The decision had been made by the Trump administration in February 2020 to withdraw all foreign military. That was on the timetable. The direction that we had from the government in London was that we're going to try and keep an embassy open, to fulfill the tasks it had been there to do for the last 20 years. The snag, the catch in that was you're doing it without any military support. So, that was the size of the problem.
And did you, I mean, at that point, this is before you deployed, before you get to the country, did you think, I mean, as an outsider, was it difficult to judge the speed at which the Taliban insurgency was going to succeed? I mean, did you have a feeling of like, okay, this is the plan A, I'm going to go in there, run an embassy in a difficult circumstances? Or did you also have that thought in your head, I could be the guy that lowers the flag in Kabul and gets on an airplane out of there?
Yeah. So I go a bit further than that. I mean, first of all, of course, the scenarios had been worked through in London. I mean, I can't go into all of the details of that for obvious reasons. At the end of 2020, beginning of 2021, it was quite hard in those circumstances to see a best case scenario emerging from where things stood on the battlefield, the state of the Afghan government, and the fact that the decision had been taken in the White House to withdraw all NATO forces, UK, US, the whole lot. My personal view was, which I, for obvious reasons, largely kept to myself at the time, it's almost certainly going to be me lowering the flag. But, the role quite often, and again, you'll be familiar with this, is to do the best you can with the hand you've been dealt. Whatever the circumstances by 2020-21, there was still really serious UK interests engaged in Afghanistan. Of course, the risks of attacks against us and our interests by Al-Qaeda or by then Islamic State. The more intangible question of how much we'd invested over 20 years in that country. And I don't need to remind you what that amounted to. I mean, you're talking about huge amounts of resource, huge amounts of political capital, but also the lives of 457 British soldiers. So, although you go in with a degree of pessimism, that's the only sane way to approach this. It's also with a sense of what would it take to maximize our chances of something like success here? How do you even define success?
Yeah, I mean that's a very fascinating. So you get on the plane, you go there, and then just describe, because the embassy is a villa within a kind of protected compound, and a lot of your decisions seem to circle around. It's not safe. Put it that way. There's a description at one point of a car bomb going off. Yeah, just describe the environment. You arrive in Kabul. And just talk a little bit about what that was like.
Well, I mean, Kabul, a bit like Baghdad during those years in Iraq, what you've got is it's a green zone. So it's a very, very highly fortified city within a city. And there are good reasons for that. There'd been major attacks against the international presence and against the government for about as many years as we'd been there. And on my watch, there were two really big ones. One was the rocket attack on the morning of Eid against the government. I was sitting there eating my porridge. The rockets were going overhead. Of course, the thing you can't unthink is slightly different pattern of maybe a bit less fuel in one of the rockets. They're landing on us. So that's the size of the risk. The other one was a suicide attack against the defense minister's house. So again, early mid-evening, I was actually doing my ironing of all things, which led to some fairly comic exchanges on the WhatsApp exchanges. And all of a sudden, there's this sort of gigantic bomb goes off a couple of streets away and a firefight and all the rest of it. But I mean, back to the question here. So what that means is that you're trying to maintain situational awareness, to give London a an accurate, unvarnished view of what's actually happening on the ground in an environment where our ability to see that is closing in almost by the day, and to influence the government, from President Ghani on downwards, as to what the size of the problem is that we're trying to deal with collectively in a world where really, frankly, I don't think he knew any more about it than I did. And some of my later conversations with him, I think, were really quite worrying in the sense that, does this guy sitting in front of me, the president, the commander-in-chief, does he get what's happening here and how fast?
So that brings me onto the characters. So if you take the Afghan, so Ghani, but then you're quite clear, for example, and this is something that I thought came out very well in your book about the Pakistani angle, and then you've got a situation where maybe I'll go say his name right.
Hamidullah Mohib.
Mohib. Sorry, Mohib. Sort of, he says something about the Pakistan being a brothel, and you're in your head thinking, one of the key things here, and one of the few leverages you seem to think that we've got, is through Pakistan. I mean, how do you manage these situations with the characters within the government? I mean, what real influence do you have there, if any?
Well, I'll answer the question in sort of more general terms, because obviously there's more involved than the individual personalities. By this stage, this is sort of mid-2021, there'd been an initiative going on for a bit of time, almost a sort of last throw of the dice, to try to get the Pakistani military to rein the Taliban in, to try and achieve some kind of political soft landing. And that line of discussion was led by the Chief of the Defence Staff back in London, and the advice that I was putting in from the Kabul end, and my predecessor was putting in from the Kabul end, is essentially, how do we maximise the chances of success here? My own view on that is that by the time this was happening, really was a last throw of the dice, and we were at the point where Pakistan, particularly the Pakistani military, had for years played this game with the Taliban, with the government of Afghanistan, where basically they called it strategic depth. What they didn't want was an anti-Pakistani, a country hostile to Pakistan on their western flank, too much influenced by India. And one of the ways that they did that was through supporting the Taliban. As in many things in life, be careful what you wish for. And I think Pakistan is now discovering that in terms of their own problems with the Taliban. But as I said earlier, I mean, this is one of those things where there's no reason anymore not to give it a try, but don't overestimate the chances of success.
Yeah, and so you're there, and so the US have decided they're going to go, and then you get you're there during the transition of command. The US have said they're going to withdraw, and you're quite critical, really, I think I can say critical, of the Doha Agreement, which is essentially the framework set up by Trump, which is through which this brokerage process was supposed to be a deal brokered with the Taliban, which really isn't working. And so on the ground, you're seeing the transition. You got the US withdrawing. I mean, talk to me a bit about that, about the Doha Agreement, how you saw that playing out within Afghanistan.
Well, I mean, the question, is it working, really depends on what you're trying to achieve. And it's really worth having a look at that agreement, the Doha Agreement, February 2020.
Yeah.
It is an agreement between the Trump administration and the Taliban. And what that agreement says, summarizing, is all foreign forces will leave within 14 months. And in return, we would like you, the Taliban, to negotiate with the Afghan government. That's it. There's no conditionality there. There's no sense that unless you negotiate, unless you achieve a peace settlement, our military will stay. It sets a timetable for military withdrawal. And to be honest, if I were the Taliban, I would have done exactly what the Taliban did, which is go through the motions, not get anywhere, deliberately not get anywhere in the talks, double down on their own military action, because they understood, I think, what the Trump administration was trying to achieve, which was to disentangle itself from Afghanistan and wait us all out. That's exactly what I'd have done. You then had the election, late 2020. Biden came in beginning of 2021. There was a very short review. By this stage, of course, the military withdrawal was well underway. The Biden administration pressed a pause, reviewed the situation, came back mid-April saying, we're going to go ahead. We're going to complete the withdrawal. Again, if you put that instruction to your military commanders, the thing that naturally they're going to prioritize is force protection. So what then happened was the withdrawal happened very, very quickly. And I think one of the reasons that the Afghan government's response was frankly so weak and discombobulated was that they found until very late in the day, I don't think they could quite accept that it was really happening. Turning points for me in that were, first of all, the weekend of the 4th of July. So, the weekend when Bagram Air Base was, well, let's call it handed over. It was abandoned in the night. There wasn't really a handover there. So that's as well as a big, the big capability withdrawal. It was also a really big political turning point, because that's the point at which I think everybody realizes that's where we're going. This is going to happen. And then the next big turning point, 6th of August, the fall of the first capital, the first regional capital of the Taliban. That was Zaranj out in the west of the country. 9 days later, the whole thing was over.
And that comes across very clearly. The Bagram Air Base evacuation puzzles me. I mean, you talk about it, there were vehicles left with engines running. And it's, if you are partnering with the Afghan National Army and that's what happens, they must have felt, I'd say deserted, I'll be honest, if I'd been a military commander in those situations. For you as a diplomat, that must have been a tough moment within Kabul. I mean, what did you do when... You presumably didn't know Bagram was going to be evacuated that night?
Well, we knew it was on the timetable. We were all working to the evacuation timetable for a number of reasons. And I'll maybe come to a few of those in a moment. So we knew it was going to happen. We knew it was bound to happen. The manner of its happening, I think, was one of those moments where everybody gave a bit of a gulp. This is really happening. And I think, there's an important point when you're thinking about, diplomacy or conflict management or high politics, where the penny kind of drops. And I think that was one of them.
Yeah.
Just in terms of, our own planning, of course, we had a number of things going on for ourselves. One was the timetable of the UK military withdrawal. So almost the first thing that I did on arrival was go out to the airport to do a flag lowering with the last British contingent under the NATO Resolute Support Mission, and frankly, to say thank you. Somebody had to. But after that point, we're on our own as an embassy.
Yeah, because I mean, in your book, it's very clear, because you're not just there as a diplomat, you're responsible for a large number of staff who are now within Kabul, and your tipping point is at some point you've got to flip this and get them to the airport. And you're very clear, because without Bagram, you've got one runway in and out, haven't you, in the main Kabul airport, which is going to very shortly come under enormous pressure. So, I mean, you talk in your book, and perhaps you talk now, about what was your personal feeling about this? You were obviously wanting to keep the embassy open, keep it running, but then you've also got to think, I've got to look after my staff and get them back to the airport so I can look after them and then possibly get them out quickly.
So probably the most useful thing I can say about that, of course, everyone has their own personal views and anxieties and all the rest of it in those kinds of environment. But you need to step back and try and keep some things in balance. One of those is, why are we here? The direction is to keep that embassy open and, to achieve a limited number of very important things. Top of the list, of course, is the national security mission. That's why we're there. It's the CT mission, is to suppress the threat to the UK. The second is, in order to achieve that, you've got to have a partner to work with. So you've got to work with the Afghan government, unless you're planning to actually run Afghanistan yourself. Good luck with that. But you need an Afghan government. It needs to be functional. We need to provide it with resources, with political support, friendly advice, quite a lot of that going on. Third is it was ARAP, the Afghan Resettlement and Assistance Program. So the last iteration of this very, very long-running question, what do we do about Afghans who've worked with us, but who are therefore a threat? So whether they're military interpreters, military, embassy staff, people who hadn't worked for us, but had certainly worked with us. A few examples: female counterterrorism judges. They're first in the killing queue when the Taliban come out of the prison. So what's our obligation to them? And the last priority, of course, is, if and when the wheels come off, how do we get out of here at the right time without losing anyone on the way? And the right time bit is really, really important, because the nature of the UK's presence and commitment there meant that it's a bit like a Jenga pile. If we pull our brick out, quite a lot of the rest of it is going to fall over as well. And there's a political cost to that, as well as a potential cost in terms of, the objectives I just outlined.
Yeah, because if I suppose your risk is if they see the Brits embassy go, after Bagram, that's obviously a clear indicator things are going. But it's very interesting you talk about the evacuation. So, because again, you're very aware that you need to start planning to get people out, and there needs to be a list, there needs to be a system. And it seems like that maybe wasn't moving quite as fast as you felt it should be. I mean, there are people, like you're saying, like female judges, people, interpreters who work with, we're going to need to get these people onto an aeroplane. They're going to be killed by the Taliban. So what were you doing? How did you manage that? What was your process with this system?
Yeah. So it really comes down to a couple of things. One is the nature of the role in Kabul. I mean, I can't do the resettlement of people in the UK. I mean, that's down to the UK government, the local authorities. The huge pressure on housing and schooling and all the rest of it that we're very familiar with, and also the related question of, so who is actually in scope here? Are we talking about 1,000 people, 10,000 people, 100,000 people? What's the size of the problem? My key message to London at this time was, you've got less time than you think. Unless I'm dramatically wrong, if things go the way I think they're going, by about June or July of 2021, we might actually have months rather than years to do this. So there's your choice. You do it now, or as much of it as you can now, while you've got control over it, or you live with the consequences of not doing that. And you basically, the role there is to keep reminding London of that fact, so that they can operate the policy accordingly.
And this will become Operation Pitting. That's right. This will eventually segue into it. So, I mean, what's your interface with the military there? Are you feeding this to the British military or to defence to try and say, look, we're going to need to lift 16,000 people. They're going to come off one runway. Are you saying, is that the conversation you're having at this stage?
So there'd been a conversation going on for back into 2020 about this, with a couple of parallel tracks. One track was the operation to withdraw our military, Operation Catalog. For the embassy, for the Foreign Office, our interest in that was basically came down to, so if the embassy is staying, fine, we need to put in place the arrangements, security, life support, logistics arrangements, that we need to do that, but without the military. And bear in mind that for the previous 20 years, the embassy had been basically completely dependent on the military for all of that. So you're going to a very, very dangerous environment, an increasingly dangerous environment, without any of that military backup. If the answer is we're not staying, the safest, lowest cost way of withdrawing it is to do it as part of the military withdrawal. So that was one thing going on. And there was a very, very big decision in London just before I came out to Kabul, which was, are we staying or are we going? And for the decision to be, are we staying, we had to be able to give enough assurance to ministers that we could meet our legal and moral duty of care to staff. Basically, before you send staff into a war zone, can you protect them? The preparation for Operation Pitting, I mean, that discussion, as you know, I mean, the military do their contingency planning for these kinds of scenarios. And that had been through a number of iterations over quite a long period of time. I had some involvement in that at the London end. But this is military logistics. That's what the military do. That's what they're equipped for. It's what they're trained for. So it's very much led by the military and with the Foreign Office in support of that. Within that, what you've got, of course, is scenario planning. So to get to a bit technical for the moment, you might be familiar with graduated response options. When you're looking at your scenarios for responding, they need to be fit for the scenario you're working in. So broadly speaking, at the top end of your graduated response, the benign end of your graduated response options, basically we're all leaving on the Emirates scheduled flight. The ugly end is the military are fighting their way in and fighting their way out. And there's a spectrum in between. And of course, for all concerned, the military, the civilians, the government, you do not want to end up at that ugly scenario. So this brings you back to the question of what are the triggers and warnings that say it's time to leave now?
Yeah. But was there an identified list of people that you thought would be eligible? Were you producing that? How was that generated? How were people getting onto the list? Because that becomes a factor later on.
Yeah. I think literally everybody had a spoon of that particular pie. So, you'll be familiar with the long-running story of military interpreters, people who've worked alongside our forces in different capacities. And that question, in my view, had never been fully adequately addressed. The ARAP scheme, Afghan Resettlement and Assistance Program, was an attempt to try to bring all of the various schemes together and systematize it. But once you start looking at, for example, embassy staff, who qualifies, who doesn't? How do you run an embassy when you're taking staff out who you need to run the embassy? Or are you going to do this all in one great big surge at the end? That's probably not a smart place to be. After the collapse of the government and the ugly scenes that we saw in Kabul and the return of the Taliban and all the rest of it, entirely predictably, there was an enormous amount of political and media pressure lobbying for particular categories of people. So I mentioned the terrorism judges. There was a push from a number of editors of national news outlets to get Afghan journalists out. In my view, rightly. I mean, again, there was a very, very high risk to life to those people. The question lurking in all of that, though, it's twofold. I mean, how do you prioritize, and how do you? What's the size of the envelope that you're looking at? Because you can't do either sensibly unless you have a good answer to that. And when you're doing it under crisis conditions in the middle of the night with competing political agendas in London and elsewhere, well, you know what it looked like in the news.
Yeah, I mean, we know what it looked like from this end, obviously not from your side. So what was the tipping point where you decide that you're going to close the embassy? What was because obviously we've now, Bagram's chart, we're losing, regional capitals are falling, and then you had a very clear sort of structure. Okay, this is the point where I've got to get my staff back to the airport and set up there for what's going to be the final thing.
So that kind of decision, I've been involved in a few embassy closures in my time. That kind of decision is not one that the ambassador takes. It's an enormous decision. Obviously, you advise, you're one of a number of people advising, but ultimately that's a decision for ministers, for the cabinet, for the prime minister. The decision point really came, I would say, about the 12th of August, where it's increasingly starkly clear that this is going to collapse in the coming days. So what happened at that time was that the decision in principle was taken to close the embassy. At about the same time, a decision was taken to start flowing UK forces back into Kabul to assist with any evacuation. And there were similar decisions taking place in Washington at the time. The issue, as it turned out, the really important issue was that military redeployment back into Kabul, large numbers of Americans, substantial numbers of British soldiers, hadn't been completed by the 15th of August. So on the 15th of August, in the morning, there's Ghani at his desk issuing instructions to the forces that were frankly no longer there. By the afternoon, he was in a helicopter and the Taliban were at the desk. But by that time, there were not enough soldiers in Kabul to hold the airport. And then, of course, you saw what unfolded over the next couple of days.
Were you surprised by that final moments and how fast it happened? Because it shocked the world. I mean, I think everyone was. I personally wasn't that surprised, but that was me. But I think the world was shocked by the speed at which that final collapse happened. Were you personally thinking, I didn't think this was going to happen that quickly?
Honestly, by about the 12th, I think my sense is this is going to be over in the next few days. So the question for us now is, who do we need to get out? How much time, if any, have we got to do that? What are the size, what are the nature of the risks that we're going to be dealing with that time? So it sounds very dry. But what we're talking about here is, are we going to lose people? Are people going to die doing this? Because when you're asking ministers, asking the prime minister to take that kind of decision, they need to know. Because there are huge political risks, there are huge legal risks. They're going to get sued if you misjudge that one. They're going to have to face up to the media and parliament and grieving relatives and all the rest of it. So, it's I don't think you have any right to be surprised in that sense. That said, I think absolutely everybody was startled at the speed of the final collapse, including the Taliban themselves. So there was this period of about 24 hours where when the question is, so are they going to enter Kabul or not? Of course, they were already in Kabul in some respects, but there was sort of toing and froing about what the Taliban's intentions were. And this, of course, was a problem for us because we did not know at that stage what their intentions were towards us.
I mean, that it seemed surreal just from reading your book and your descriptions that you've got this situation where you've got, I mean, it's two para who are coming in to guard the airfield along with the American elements. You don't have enough of them on the ground. I mean, just for a civilian audience, they would never have been able to hold that airfield had the Taliban gone for it. There is no way militarily that would have been defensible. So you've got a situation where you've got an incoming military force, you're going back to the airport, and the Taliban are driving around town. I mean, it is a surreal. So you now move to the airport, and what's your first priorities there? You get set up. You've got the Baron Hotel. Do you want to talk through what you thought and what your immediate priorities were?
Yeah. So well, just to describe the situation we had, there was a small military airbase on Kabul airfield, just south of the runway, called Camp Taipan. We'd also earlier that year, as an embassy, put down the kind of deposit on the Baron Hotel that you would not wish to have to explain to the Public Accounts Committee if you lost it. Essentially, it was the deal there was, even when the time comes, we're using your hotel as our evacuation handling centre. I think one of the big differences, one of the big positive differences between our planning and literally everyone else's, was that this is pretty much the well-established way in which the UK does military evacuations, non-combatant evacuations. You have a safe, or a relatively safe, evacuation handling centre, a centre of operations at the sharp end. You have what's called a temporary safe location. For us, it was Minhad Air Base in Dubai. Your high-end assets on just getting the people you need to move through that process to your temporary safe location, and then you ship them on wide-bodied commercial airlines from there back to the UK. This is, I think, the point at which I really take my hat off to our own military, both in terms of the planning of Operation Pitting, so largely done and led by Brigadier Dan Blanchford,
Yeah.
and the performance of 2 and 3 para in putting that perimeter around the airport. Exactly as you say, we could not take anything for granted, including any of us getting out of here. If you remember, the runway was basically overrun on the 16th of August because there weren't enough forces there to hold it. And until you've got enough soldiers in to regain control of the runway, nobody is leaving. So, work it out.
Yeah, I mean, it's extraordinary. Laurie, are you saying the British are very good at evacuations? Because I might back you up on that one. We've got a long history of doing it quite well, but it sounds like we had But I hear what you're saying, because it comes out in the book that our planning seemed to be good. I mean, it seemed to be something that you and the guys were over, and I think it's a credit to you and all the military who deployed there. So just now we've got the Baron Hotel. I'm just going to go through, because this is the people I think will be interested in the mechanics of it. The Baron Hotel, you have a gate there. How's the process now working to get people through onto the airfield and processed? So these are evacuees that are coming into the airport.
To describe it as a gate, I think, implies a more orderly situation than certainly met the eye. What you have is it's the reason we chose it, the Baron, is because it's a big complex, hotel complex with high walls and towers and gun emplacements and all the rest of it around it. Anyone familiar with Afghanistan will know that kind of arrangement. So it meant that we were able to control the space in which we would do the screening of people to be evacuated. So broadly speaking, what you had outside the gate, you've got this street along the perimeter of the airfield. The other side of the street was the perimeter wire, basically. So you've got what felt like at times like the entire population of Afghanistan out in that street, and somehow you've got to get into the hotel the people you think qualify for evacuation, so you can check them and process them. And again, this is where I come back to the role played by the military. I mean, you're asking 18-year-old soldiers with the kind of experience that implies to do crowd control, sometimes riot control, having absolutely no idea who were the hostiles in that crowd. Although if you look at the pictures, you can work it out. I mean, they were standing up close and personal to Talibs for quite a lot of that time. So the moment anyone lost their cool, the consequences are quite unimaginable. And scared, desperate people do the things that scared, desperate people do. So, the job of the military was to try and find the right people in that crowd, bring them in. And then, of course, we had a joint military, Foreign Office, Home Office, MOD team whose job in the hotel was to screen people through. Basically, are they who they say they are? Bear in mind, this is Afghan documentation, which in some cases means no documentation. Large extended families. So are these children this person's children or not? How do you tell? And do they fit your criteria for evacuation? So people working under incredible pressure, very, very long hours, summer heat, no sanitation. Again, I think it's just worth pausing on what the team did, the joint military civilian team did in circumstances where you could not reasonably ask people to do that stuff.
I mean, I thought your descriptions were really clear there. And there were two things that really struck out. One of which, as you say, was the 18-year-old soldiers. And on occasion, it appeared that they went back out into the crowd because you identified people who were trying to get through to get evacuated. And people were actually going out and the Taliban are there, they're the other side of the wire, and they're going back out. I mean, this is because someone's coming and you're trying to identify them and get them into the compound.
There are some extraordinary stories there, not all of which can be told, but I think you basically covered it, particularly with people to whom we, for whatever reason, owed major obligation for reasons I hardly need to spell out. Of course, almost by definition, they are people who the Taliban might be looking for.
I mean, yeah, I think the British military, as it always does, it shared itself with glory there. But also yourself, because I think you were one of the things I picked up in the book. You were very instrumental in streamlining the system of assessment. Because so you had a very slow. It was way too slow. The system of assessing who was going to be evacuated, and you personally were very involved in that. Do you want to talk about that a bit? How you streamlined it?
Yeah, I wouldn't claim personal credit for that. As always in these things, it's a team effort. And I have to give credit to my own staff, a staff of volunteers. We ask in that kind of environment, you ask for volunteers, just something to bear in mind. There is, we had more volunteers than we could use. So we might come back a bit later to some points about public service, So what you've got is this chaotic environment where people are making a claim to be evacuated, whether or not they have a very strong claim or no claim at all on us. You've got sometimes contradictory instructions, directions coming from London because of the political pressures that people are under in London. You've got the logistical pressures. You're doing this through let's just describe it as the American evacuation, which was nothing like ours, but 10 times the size, or maybe 5 times the size. Maybe just one point to dwell on here for a moment is the kind of moral pressures that puts on the staff involved. So, I had this conversation a number of times with the senior military in Kabul, where basically part of your role is to give cover to your own staff, whether it's a decision about an evacuation or how you're going to insulate them from the political controversy. There's the media circus back in the UK. But basically, my direction of my staff is you're going to have to live with your decisions for a long time, so make sure it's the right one.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about that, the media scrum. How did you handle that? Because you're trying to make sensible decisions under enormous pressure in circumstances that few people have to face. Yet you have this extraordinary political public sort of showdown going on in the West on the media. I mean, how did you handle all that? What did you do?
So your word sort of media showdown. I certainly struggle for words to use about this. I think probably the most useful thing I can say is that this was a moment of national trauma as much as anything else. You're withdrawing from a country, from a campaign in which we had invested so much over 20 years. So whatever the behaviors and motivations of some of the people involved, it's just worth pausing on that. It was a really, really big moment. When you are at the sharp end, quite a lot of the job, it's easy to say, much harder to do, is just try and take the personality out of it. Your job is to explain to the public what we're doing and why. And of course, you're doing that in very, very difficult circumstances. But just a bit of color as to how we ended up doing that. Obviously, the media environment was pretty difficult for all sorts of reasons. One of the ways that we devised to get the message out in a more controlled way was very, very short 60-second YouTube videos. So basically, it was me talking into an iPhone with a piece of A4 with sort of 5 memory jogging words on it in whatever the environment was. And these things were getting picked up and used by the mainstream media, and one of them got about 1.5 million views of this kind of thing. But what you're trying to do there is put a face on the story, but also get across to the public what is happening here, why, what is it, what are we doing, what are your representatives, what are the people you employ to do this kind of thing, what are they doing?
It's so interesting because when I was talking to Stuart Tootle about the first Hellman, there was actually a news blackout. So do you think, I mean, you, from your point of view as a diplomat, the press can be useful? I mean, you talk about how effective the Taliban, for example, were at controlling the narrative. Did you feel that because often you were asked for interviews and you weren't allowed to do them. Is that the correct terminology?
Pretty much. Yeah. So on the Taliban, I mean, there's a real case study there in the effective use by the Taliban of propaganda. Their propaganda campaign was absolutely brilliant in the sense that what it did was contribute to the demoralization of the Afghan army. We could see it working out in real time. But one of the problems we had was that the propaganda effort, the public communications effort of the Afghan government was just nowhere. This was a problem that we're having to deal with in the moment, but it had very deep roots, going back many years, to do with the nature of the politicians and their characters, but also the problem of building a legitimate state that's propped up by foreign forces. So there are lots and lots of things going on there. In terms of our own media, as you say, but I've worked a lot with the media over the years in different environments. My perspective on this is that the best journalists really, really know their stuff. And so there's always a two-way trade in there when you're doing background briefings. You're pooling knowledge as much as anything else, but from a different perspective, a different standpoint. The other is they're going to tell the story anyway. So really what your choice comes down to is, do you wish to get your side of the story across or not?
Yeah, I mean, I think that was kind of clear in your narrative. It's interesting that's your opinion, because I think a lot of people would agree with you. I'd probably agree with you. When you're in situations like that and you're managing essentially, well, it is a crisis, it's good to have your narrative, because in the UK, that wasn't what was happening. In the UK, it was sort of hysterical, and there were all sorts of presumably demands being made of you, and we don't want to talk about animal welfare, but there was demands made of you that didn't really fit with the picture that you were faced in that airport trying to get people off the ground. I suppose another question of, you were always shadowing a much bigger American evacuation, American problem. You talked about this because you could have been swamped by the American evacuation, and so you're having the conversation with, was there Ambassador Ross? He was still in country at this point? Yeah. And so
yeah, it was Ross Wilson.
Yeah. So you having conversations with him about, we're going to do this, are you going to do that at this point?
Up to a point. I think there's a long running story here, which we saw in Afghanistan and we saw in Iraq, and I think we're seeing elements of it now actually in Ukraine and the Russian invasion. It's about, how do you deal effectively with a partner that is much, much bigger than you, and well, at least believes it has the option of essentially just transmitting rather than listening. And part of the problem that we had in the final stages in Afghanistan was, as you say, first of all, the risk of being swamped. The American embassy in Kabul, by the time it closed, was still in the thousands. Mine, by direction from ministers in London, was essentially, how many people can we get on one C-17?
Yeah.
So, part of the question for us is, what's a sort of minimum viable embassy to achieve those priority tasks that I set out earlier? But even when it comes to it, how are we getting them all out? And for us, that was compounded by the problem that if we're doing this in a situation where the government has collapsed, the army has collapsed, no one is in charge or worse, and the Americans are doing it at the same time, their operation is going to dwarf us. are we going to get, basically, are we going to get trodden on by the elephant on the way out? So that brings you back to the timing of the decision. You're looking for that sweet spot, if that's the right word, where that's the last safe opportunity to leave. I think we probably pretty much got it.
I mean, I think opportunity pitting, I have to say, I think it was a success. I can't say anything else. I think that given the circumstances, the pressures you were under, and I mean, you know, what was it? I got it here: 15,000 people, 100 flights, 38 nations. I mean, it's impressive evacuation. But there came a point where you knew this is it. It's going to, you know, you're going to close down the operation. So that presumably wasn't your decision. You were told that, or this is the end of it, or was it just something on the ground where you knew, right, the Taliban have had enough of this, they're going to come, and we've got to shut up shop?
But there are a few factors involved there. But one, of course, is what's the limit of the Taliban's tolerance? And it was pretty clear that from fairly earlier on that they were prepared to let us do what we needed to do, us and the Americans and others, but only up to a point. And over time, their tolerance of that sharply reduced. There were occasions when they were telling the Americans, telling us indirectly, "You're stripping out all the people that we need to run the country. Stop doing it." We're told that, by the way, by the Ghani administration as well. So again, one of the sort of dilemmas that we had in deciding who to evacuate before the 15th of August. But the long and the short of it is that they made it perfectly clear that they were not going to they're not going to tolerate any further presence of foreign forces after the end of August, and that any foreign forces still there will be considered hostile. So you'll be back into the risk of a war with the Taliban, which in the circumstances wouldn't have been a sensible thing to do. So then what happens is that you're working backwards. The military planners are working backwards. And again, you'll be familiar with this. Who are the last people to leave? That's the most dangerous flight of all. And then you work backwards from that. The other development in all of this, of course, was the Islamic State attack on the Abbey Gate.
Yeah.
So what happened was that one of the prisoners released from Parwan, the prison at Bagram Air Base, was an Islamic State suicide bomber, and he turned up in the crowd outside the Abbey Gate, which was the entrance to the US evacuation chain, very, very close to the entrance to the Baron Hotel, and blew himself up. So you had this situation where it was a sort of security, political thing where your days from the end of the evacuation. All of a sudden, the security environment has got even worse than it was before. You've just lost 13 US servicemen and women, a couple of hundred Afghans, right in the last few days, yet more people dying. It's time to call an end to this.
I mean, incredibly tough. And then, you get on the plane. I mean, that's the end of it. What were your feelings coming out of Kabul? I mean, if you can describe, I mean, were you just in the middle of it? But I mean, as you decompress, okay, but what did you feel about the experience?
Lots of things, as I think most people did. One is relief. It's over. We did what we needed to do. We're out of here. Compounded with a pretty powerful sense of relief that we didn't lose any one of ours along the way, at least not our staff or military. And it's not hard to imagine circumstances in which we would be leaving, having lost people. Adrenaline. Did you sleep on the plane? You must be joking. I mean, are you serious? Apart from anything else, I mean, the phone was just going and going and going and going for days afterwards, with all the usual things. Can you get me out? Can you get this person out? Can you get that person out? And it's a horrible thing to do. You have to mess with saying, sorry, we've left. And then I think there is the slightly sort of slower burn. So I know that pretty much all of my civilian colleagues and military colleagues were put through similar processes in terms of how do you come to terms with what you just did. You'll be very, very familiar with it. And I think, for me, that was, again, one of the reasons for writing the book. It's just a way of telling that story, what those people achieved.
Did someone say you've done a really good job?
I have many things said about that book. Look, it's an honest attempt to describe, to make sense of what I thought I was seeing at the time. I've had a few, actually more than a few, quiet thank yous just for telling the story and for choosing to do it in that tone. I'm not interested in recrimination or butt covering. I think we all have a lot to learn from that episode. Quite a lot of it positive, actually. When I come back to your point about the success of Operation Pitting, that is the result of really serious, effective planning and operation by the military in cooperation with the civilians. The UK does this stuff well. But one of the things I do now with my students, I'm now working at university, is just hold up that picture, the famous one of the inside of the C-17 with all those faces staring back at you, and ask, is this a picture of success or failure? When the point is, it's both. The two things are very, very closely related.
I mean, yeah, it's fascinating. Well, perhaps we can talk a little bit more widely. I mean, I think your book's excellent, and I think personally you should be very proud of what you achieved there. I think that and I encourage people to read it because the descriptions are very, very vivid of what that was like, the decision making within that scenario. But obviously, I feel there are also lessons here. I think one of the lessons I particularly, and I don't know whether this was in the book deliberately or not, the Doha Agreement, the failure to structure a peace agreement. I mean, we're sort of echoing that a little bit now with something that's happening in Ukraine, and you're a Russia expert. I mean, do you have a more general feeling that there are lessons here that could be taken forward in diplomacy now?
Loads. So let's start with the Doha deal. I mean, the starting point for any kind of negotiation is, what are you trying to achieve? And by the way, I think this is one of the threads that runs through the whole 20-year campaign in Afghanistan. Because if you're looking at how a war might end, you need to consider why it started in the first place and what are your range of available options. What do you want to happen as a result of this? It's pretty clear to me that, I mean, the Doha Agreement is not much more than the Trump administration's decision to walk away. And I think there are serious echoes of that in the second Trump administration's approach to Russia and Ukraine. Obviously, they're very different scenarios, but that, I think, is something that we need to be really clear about. What are you trying to achieve? What do you understand the issue to be here? In terms of why the war started, I think there's again, it comes back to this point about the role of expertise and analytical strength and capability that we need to think about how we build systematically across government, not just in the Foreign Office, in the military, the intelligence agencies, the whole lot. The ability to read correctly an opponent's motivations as well as your own. Because unless you can do that, you're not within sight of being able to answer that question. How does this end? How does it end for us? There are some more general points in there that I come back to again and again around habits of thinking. So if you look at some of the public debate around Russia's invasion of Ukraine and some of the discussion at the time around Afghanistan, about Iraq, if you want to go back further, there are some common themes emerge. And the ones that I always come back to are cognitive biases, optimism bias and confirmation bias. Things will go as well as they possibly could because we want them to go as well as they possibly could. Hang on a minute. Confirmation bias. This fits our view of what's happening here. This doesn't, so we'll go for this rather than this. And all of the things that follow from that about how you learn from mistakes. Or what I say to my students is, study failures as much as study successes. They happen for a reason. You need to get under the skin of why. What happened here? What went wrong? Why did it go wrong? How do you avoid it happening again in the future? I mean, of course, for the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there's another factor here, which is how it's all become bound up in that all-important relationship for us with the United States and our European partners and neighbours. So we're now as the UK, in the rather strange position where our political and security objectives in Europe are much, much closer to our European neighbours than they are to the Americans. What are we going to do about that? We can sort of describe it and lament it or say it isn't so, but we do need to actually address that question head on pretty fast now.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are lots of things. And of course, one of the things that struck me now is obviously the Foreign Commonwealth Office and DFID are now merged. So you've got one of the things that struck me about the whole of the Afghan project, and this is well before your time, is the role, because I was military, right? So the military can provide certain solutions. In case of insurgency, a lot of things, we can provide a bit of an environment for the rest to happen. But should there be far more integration? Because it strikes me that if there are two things I would take away from the Afghan experience, one of which was the Pakistani issue, which never got dealt with, which is the insurgency route of supply, which was always there. But the second one is the failure to integrate any kind of foreign Commonwealth reconstruction effort with a military effort to integrate all of those.
I mean, well, those involved at the time need to answer for themselves, but on the general principle, I agree 110%. What you've got in these very, very complex problems is some part of it might be best addressed by military means. Some are societal, political questions which are, will probably be made worse by the application of military force. And somewhere in the middle, you've got to come back to this all-important question: why are we doing any of this? What are we trying to achieve? Are we trying to build Sweden in the middle of Central Asia? Well, probably not. Are we trying to suppress Al-Qaeda or Islamic State? Certainly. How do we go about building a viable state in a country that's never had anything that what we would understand as a viable state? So you've got to suppress the threats to that state. And one of the ways you might do that might be through counterinsurgency, but there's a price for that. So if you take a society like Afghanistan and you bring in 130,000 foreign forces, which is what it was at the height of the Obama surge, they go around doing counterinsurgency stuff, how on earth are you going to build the legitimacy of the state that they're supporting while you're doing that? How are you going to do that? I mean, I just can't answer that question. And I think to bring it back to the heart of the dilemma that we faced in Afghanistan, basically, I think we trapped ourselves. We all trapped ourselves. The military couldn't leave couldn't safely leave because we hadn't created the political conditions for them to leave. And the military couldn't not leave because we hadn't created the political condition. If you see what I mean, you're stuck either way. If 20 years into a campaign you're stuck either way, you probably need to go back much earlier and think about the paths you didn't take.
Yeah, no, I think those are wise words. I think they really are. I mean, we've talked for a while now. It's fascinating. I want to just pick you up. You mentioned something about public service. So what's your opinion on that? Would you expand on that idea, public service?
Yeah. So one of the things that I've thought about a lot over the years, I mean, working in different ways in both Afghanistan and on Russia and on, counterterrorism and national security issues in London. We need to face some facts here. We ask our people, to do some really, really difficult things that nobody would ever be asked to do in any other line of work, frankly. They don't do it for the money. So what do they do it for? And I think there's a whole point here about the values of public service. I think the diplomatic service, the military have strong cultures of their own. But we need to think about what that culture actually is and how to nurture it. And it's not just in the moment. So, one of the things I have come to learn from my time in Afghanistan, in particular, is the tale of consequences for people that you put in that position. So, just a little example for you. I mean, I'm sure that people concerned wouldn't mind me telling this. The autumn of 2021, I went to the parachute regiment headquarters in Colchester, my hometown actually, to talk to their officers about Russia, the next thing coming. Obviously, they arranged for me to meet some of the people who'd done the evacuation from Kabul. But the point is that as you walk in, you see this big list of names on the wall. I don't need to spell out what that list of names is. And one of the troopers who I recognised actually from the Baron Hotel eventually asked me, "Sir, would you mind telling me what the fuck that was all about?" And he didn't mean the evacuation. So I think what I'm saying is that if you're going to ask as a nation, if you're going to ask people to do this kind of thing, you need to value them, and they need to understand what the deal is, what it is that you are asking them to do, why they should say yes.
I think that is absolutely bang on. I think that is the thing that I think a lot of people have said. I mean, I was talking to Stuart Tootle, CEO of the Free Para, who went in at the beginning, and it's not to say that if there were policy mistakes, if things went wrong, you can't denigrate the fact that these men and women went out there to do their very best and did it in incredibly difficult circumstances. And we need to value that commitment. Our government sent them there to do a job, and they did their very, very best. I mean,
Well, that was essentially my answer to the question. You did what was asked of you. Thank you.
yeah. I mean, this has been a fascinating chat, Laurie, right? Well, we've talked for about an hour or so. So have you got things you would like to add to anything that we've said or expand on?
I mean, we could probably carry on all day.
We could. I mean, that's the thing about
some of these
podcasts.
issues.
There's no limit to it. I mean, we've covered an enormous amount there. I mean, the only thing I was going to ask you, maybe as a sort of parting thing, because of your Russia experience, you know, we're in a situation where there's a sort of promise of peace. There's a promise of peace. You've been ambassador to Moscow, probably know better than anyone. And just from the Russian point of view, because we can leave the Trumpisms out of this because that's being driven by a different agenda.
Yeah.
What would see an end for Putin, do you think? What would the factors be that would see him stop?
There's a really big point here about understanding how wars end and why they start. So it comes back to this question about what is the role of a diplomat or an analyst or anybody else working in this kind of space. Start by understanding what you're dealing with and why it's happening. With Russia, I think what we're dealing with here is the long tail of consequences from how the Cold War ended. So for most of us, we're both old enough to remember those years. We're going from a world in which we thought that this is what we've got for the rest of our lives. And if it ends, it probably ends in annihilation, to a world where all of a sudden we're in a completely different environment, one of possibility and hope and all the rest of it. For a number of people, particularly in the current Russian leadership, it's anything but that. It's about humiliation and loss and anger. You don't need to speak Russian if you're watching Putin giving his public speeches, you can see the anger and the resentment coming out and the humiliation he feels behind that. And he's determined to rectify that. Whether he's right or wrong it doesn't matter. That's what he's about. So if you look at the way that he talks about the West, the way he talks about Ukraine, the way he talks about Russia, this is not going to end in the kind of land for peace deal that you would get where you've got, a sort of a quid pro quo that everybody can live with. This ends either when the Ukrainians agree terms of capitulation or Russia fundamentally changes. Russia will not fundamentally change while Putin is alive. So what we've got here, we need to face some facts here. I mean, I think it's possible that we might get to a ceasefire if the terms of the ceasefire are clearly better for Russia or less bad for Russia than the alternative of fighting on. Unless that's the case, they will fight on. And we need to be clear about that. And even if they agree a ceasefire, I can tell you from personal experience, a ceasefire with Putin never means the ceasing of fire. It means the next stage in the conflict. So we need to think in that timescale. This is a problem we're dealing with for the next maybe 10 or 20 years. And it's not only about Ukraine, it's about Russia and it's about us. And we really need to wise up to that.
I mean, that's fascinating. And that's a real insight because, obviously from my military head, I'm thinking we're offering commitment to a peacekeeping force. Well, I've been in a few of those in my time. The idea of being a peacekeeping force facing the Russians is horrific. To me, in my mind, I'm thinking, unless that peace deal was something that was very, very secure, I would be worried by that, I think.
I don't think there's any world in which the current Russian leadership will agree to military forces from NATO countries being in Ukraine. Why are they there? They're there to deter Russia. He's not going to agree to that.
No, it's fascinating. Well, look, Laurie, this has been fascinating. And I think that your book, I'll just put your book up at the end. This is a great read. Everyone should read this. I'll put it in the show notes and everything. And thank you very much for your time and all the stuff you're doing, which is great. And I hope people are learning from you and your experiences now. And I hope you continue to spread the word.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much.